All right. Hello, Apters. We are supposedly live right now. So we will get this review started as usual. It says I can go up to 8 hours. Probably won't need that long. Of course, it all depends on your questions. Let's see. A lot of people logged on early, so that's really good. The questions tonight, we'll try to keep it on topic. If you have questions about your test specifically for my class, then take a look at the test information presentation. 40 multiple choice questions tomorrow, and then you will have a long essay question on Thursday in class. If you have more questions about the essay, you can ask me in class tomorrow, but other than that, not giving any hints. So thanks for kind of the wait. Not only did I just get home about 7:55, but my computer had to restart, so a little bit of a delay there. So it's up to you. It's your questions. I'm about 30% of the way through Red Dead Redemption 2, so I can answer some questions. No spoilers for me or you, though. I would not like to have that. But we can talk about world history, and that's kind of what we're here for. Time period 3 is our post-classical era, from 600 CE and the rise of Islam to 1450 CE, which is the basically which we consider to be the eve of globalization, the eve of the global era in the world. And so let's get to it. Nobody seems to have any questions quite yet. So we'll kind of wait for those to populate. So we'll kind of wait on that. So one of the questions is about the Americas. We can get to that. I like this question. What do we need to know about the basic timeline of events that happen in this time period? So one of the things that really helps that, you're pretty much, I believe most chapters of your textbook actually have timelines of events. But let's go through it and think about the timeline of events. I was trying to pull up the chapter where this unit starts. Let's think just kind of in general. So the first thing to consider is the beginning of this unit, right? We have this start date of 600 CE. A lot of things happening during that time. Most noteworthy, I would say, is the rise of Islam. The religion of Islam comes about first half of the 7th century in the 600s. 622 is the beginning of the Muslim calendar, when Muhammad is run out of Mecca, basically flees to Medina in the Hijra. And so that is kind of a major cultural turning point. There is also a political turning point that really begins in our last time period, and that is the decline of the classical empires. So whether it's the Han Dynasty around the year 220 CE, or the Gupta in 550, or the Romans in 476, the Western Roman Empire anyways, we saw a general decline of empires at the end of the classical era. And around the year 600, we see a revival of these. Some slightly before 600, right? The Sui Dynasty is just before 600. And it's, of course, the precursor to the Tong Dynasty. You have the Byzantine Empire, which never really goes away, but Justinian, who's right there before this kind of break of the year 600. He revives the Byzantine Empire. So we start to see these at the same time. We have the decline and then the rise of kind of a new group of empires, civilizations. With the rise of Islam also is the rise of the Islamic Caliphates, right? This new form of government. that comes about in this time period. In Europe, not long after 600, in the year 800, you have the Carolingian dynasty, but for the most part, you have feudalism in Europe in this era. So that's kind of the beginning. If we were thinking geographically, China, you have the Sui and the Tong dynasty, and it lasts until about the year 900. Then the Song dynasty comes along, that lasts till about 1279, when the Mongols defeat the Song dynasty and the Yuan Empire is declared. That will decline in favor of the Ming, which appears right at the end of this time period. In the Middle East, the timeline would mostly coincide with the caliphates. First, the Rashidun Caliphate, then the Umayyad Caliphate, which lasts until, I want to say, around 750, and then the Abbasid Caliphate, which lasts until the 1200s. And the last Abbasid Caliph is killed, of course, by the Mongols. In that time period, you have some fragmentation in the Middle East, of course. As Turkish peoples move in, the Seljuk Turks play an important role for a time there. Europe, the Carolingians, then you have, in general, feudalism. Although around the year 1100, you have like a really important fight between Christians of Europe and Muslims of the Middle East. That is the Crusades, when Western European Christians invade the Middle East, attempting to take back the Holy Land. So I would say, if you're thinking timeline-wise, kind of in this, remember the course is all about trends. So what trends do we see across this time? But I would say, look at it by region. If you're trying to get Chinese dynasty straight, if you're trying to find out what's going on in the Islamic world or whatever it is, think of it in that way. Now, the date 1450, right? If we think about the end date here, you have the Ming Dynasty retreating from the Indian Ocean. They're still going to continue to exist, right, into our next time period. But they basically exit the Indian Ocean right at about the time Europeans start exploring, which is one of the big markers of 1450 as an important turning point in history. The exploration of the West African coast by the Portuguese, the arrival of Columbus in the Americas in 1492, the arrival of Portugal to India with Da Gama in 1498, I want to say. Those, of course, are important things that are going on. But another kind of marked turning point is the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which in 1450, we deal mostly with them next period, but this small Turkish group that in the decline of the Ilkhanate in the Middle East starts to gain power and start to conquer land in Anatolia and then throughout the Middle East, eventually conquering the city of Constantinople in 1453. That's kind of that other bookend to this date. Of course, the major turning point is going to really be the rise of Europe, the Europeans coming back on the scene, not just invading the Middle East, but going through, of course, their own rebirth, the Reformation, or excuse me, the Renaissance itself, and then exploring the world, reforming the church, right? We have the Reformation as the Roman Catholic Church breaks apart in Europe. So lots of stuff will be going on at the start of our next unit. So I would say that's kind of the basic timeline. The Mongols, if you kind of want some dates around there, the 1200s, 1300s, that's where they fit in this timeline. What chapters does Unit 3 cover? Well, Unit 3 is, for our course, using the Strayer textbook, it's chapters, 9, 10, 11, or 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are those chapters, I believe. Let me double check. Yes, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Although by opening up the front of your textbook, you could also find that out as well. So Ayush asks, what do we need to know about the Umayyad Caliphate? All right. Good question. The Umayyad Caliphate is one of our Islamic caliphates, it's really where we see the spread of Islam outside of the Middle East. Under the Rashidun Caliphate, the Islamic Empire had really encompassed the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula and had actually moved, starting to move into Persia. But the Umayyad Caliphate takes over after some of these fights over succession. And eventually the Umayyad clan comes to power and establishes this kind of line of succession for caliphs, which, except for the move to the Abbasids, really remains rather unbroken until 1258, when the last Abbasid Caliph is killed. As far as what you need to know about the Umayyads, the most important thing to know is that it is responsible for the spread of Islam through North Africa and even into Europe. Remember, it is the Umayyads who come into Spain and what is now Spain and Portugal, and conquers up into southern France, eventually meeting the Franks in battle and being defeated at the Battle of Tours, which is, of course, another important turning point. But in that defeat of the Battle of Tours, the spread of Islam into Europe is halted, at least for the time being, until the Ottomans around the 1450s start making their way into southeastern Europe. The Umayyads are responsible for kind of expanding the reach of the Dar al-Islam, establishing trade, but they also had some downfalls in that they only allowed Arabs to serve in their military, and that will change under the Abbasid Caliphate. And they were accused by the Abbasids, when they are overthrown, of not being so much interested in the things that Islam should be interested in, but instead being interested in like enjoying wealth in their capital city and the like. And it was a reason for the overthrow and the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750, I want to say. That's the date that's popping up, but in my head. But I have to double check that date. Other than that, for the Umayyad Caliphate, that's probably what I have on them. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I could add. Yeah, just know that's kind of like a period of rapid Islamic expansion, and will be, one of the heights of the Islamic world. How much of the test is going to be contextualizing versus regular facts? Well, everything on the test will be based on, I believe if I go back to it, most everything on this test is based on stimuli. So it's all stimulus-based questions on the multiple choice aspect, which of course requires not just contextualization, but comparison, understanding of historical argumentation, change of continuity over time, but certainly being able to contextualize the documents that you're reading. Some context is given, but also being able to situate that in your head to what is going on in the rest of the world is very important. And in general, yes, there is content. There are facts that you have to know, but you have to do something with those facts on the test. So kind of keep that in mind. Ooh, good question about the Hanseatic League. And for some reason, this also reminds me that I have skipped that question on the Americas, so I need to go back to that, and I will. But yeah, let's generally talk about the Hanseatic League. This is particularly noteworthy when we think about the Hanseatic League for understanding trade in Northern Europe. The Hanseatic League itself is established by Northern European trading cities to facilitate the movement of goods, right, between these cities. Noteworthy cities in this are places like Novgorod in Russia, which was responsible for the fur trade. Cities in Northern Europe, I think, like, I forget the map we were looking at, had something like Danzig, and it had London and I don't know, a couple other cities. You don't have to know the cities. Novgorod, probably the most important one that you need to know. But fur trade from Novgorod, Scandinavia, you have lumber, all these places on the North Sea, you have fish being traded, right? So these cities, which are all trading with each other, right? They're all on the northern shores of Europe. They band together basically to create to create more trade, but also to protect trade between member states, right? That's the big idea. They focused on the things they traded well. They set up favorable trading relationships. They even established a court system to settle disputes. And in the case that any of the members of this trading organization came under duress, or there was some kind of military need, they could even summon they could summon like ships, like a navy, a military force to protect some of these cities. So it was a pretty interesting kind of alliance system based mainly in the idea of the importance of trade in Northern Europe, especially maritime trade between these cities. The Hanseatic League is brought up in, I'm going to look through the key concepts very quickly. So to see if I can find exactly where it is, so I can read to you directly the key concept that it relates to. Yeah, so this is in key concept 3.1. Improved transportation technologies and commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade and expanded the geographical range of existing and newly active trade networks. And point D there, the part D, is that commercial growth was facilitated by state practices, including trading organizations like the Hanseatic League. Other state practices included like the building of infrastructure. So we think about like Incan road systems. We think about the Grand Canal in China. But we also think about the establishment of basically here state alliances to facilitate trade. And that's what the Hanseatic League was. Really good question. Hopefully answered it fully. No other questions have come in, so either everybody has stopped watching, or perhaps you are all enthralled and wrapped up in that question, taking your notes or listening or whatever you do. There was a question earlier about the Americas, and so I'm going to find that. How well do you need to know the Americas? Well, I guess that's not a question about the Americas, but or Americas, as it says. You need to know it well. You had a reading on that in class, and I know it was a lot to bite off. The chart that you were asked to complete was to think about these different Native American groups, right? The Inca, the Aztec, the Mississippians, and the Mayas, and how they looked through each theme of history, right? So the first one is thinking about theme number one, interactions with the environment, right? And with each of these groups, we know that they relied on their environment. So think about like the crops they grew. You know, in Mesoamerica, that would be like corn, beans, and squash. In the Inca Empire, you throw potatoes in there, right? The almighty potato. So thinking about that, but also thinking about like the limitations, like their environments did produce a lot for them. But in some cases, the Inca Empire develops a very specific way because it is in the Andes Mountains. There is a lack of beasts of burden, right, in these Americas, and you have, which of course limits how much trade can take place. There aren't really river systems, which again limits trade in a great deal of the Americas. So just kind of think through those, and hopefully you can use that chart as your study tool for this. My computer's trying to install more updates. I do not like that. Otherwise, we will be Oh, I can turn off automatic updates now. Wow, what a great update on this MacBook that I can turn off more updates. The question is, though, to expand on the Americas with trade. And so, yes, let's do that. First of all, when we think about the Americas with trade, we have to understand that trade does occur in the Americas. Just because it's cut off from Afro-Eurasia, we tend to think of the Americas, and I think it's taught a lot as trade doesn't go on here. Because look at what's going on Afro-Eurasia, and we try to distinguish and say, the Americas are very different. Just keep in mind, they're not doing the same thing. And maybe we overstate that. There was extensive trade in the Americas, but it was much more localized. The trade of the Aztecs, we know they traded as far away as with the southwestern United States because of, for example, turquoise, which was found in places like New Mexico and Arizona, has been found in the ruins of the Aztec Empire. So we know they had long distance trade. We do know that there was some coastal trade, but these people had not developed maritime technology on the levels of the Americas. And of course, we can get into all the guns, germs, and steel theories around that, but I'm not going to do that today because I don't want to bore you through it again. But there was some trade, right? There was in the Inca Empire, they built 25,000 miles of road to facilitate trade, which the government controls most of that. I'm going to flip to a very specific section. I actually have that book that you had the Americas reading in, and there's a chart that talks about a thought about some of the things they traded. I'd say go back and take a look at that. Oh, yeah. So for the Aztecs, for example, they traded as far north as San Luis Obispo in the U.S., I guess, and as far south as present-day Costa Rica. They traded along the Pacific coast as well as the Gulf and Caribbean coast. They traded cloth, cocoa, rubber in exchange for things like shells and exotic bird feathers and precious stones, right? So they're certainly engaging in a great deal of trade, of course, the things that are important to them. The states are facilitating trade, right? The Inca is the perfect example of that. And as they were road builders. The Mayans, of course, who declined by about the year 900, remember their cities that they create, of course, they're going to rely on trade. Cities can't produce everything they need to make everything go, right? They're going to have to get it from some other location. So those are just some things to keep in mind with the Americas. I think that's everything that trade base that we should think about. Yeah. So let's see. All right. Changing some stuff up. All right. And let's see what the next question is. Can you expand on the Americas with trade? Done that one. What's the difference in the way that the Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates govern? Ooh, good question. The quick answer here is that the Abbasid Caliphate is much more inclusive in how it governs, right? Under the Abbasid Caliphate, we see cultural influences that borrow from the Persians. We see cultural influences that eventually will include Turkish influences in the empire. The Abbasids also moved the capital city to Baghdad. And the caliph rules kind of like through an absolute monarchy. Later on, that kind of changes as the caliph's role. It's becomes more ceremonial than it is like what's the word? Maybe authoritative, I guess. The Yeah, it's there was a centralized bureaucratic state. The Abbasids had a military, which isn't that much different than what the Umayyads had. But I would say, for the most part, they borrow a lot from the Persian influences. All right. Let's see. Can you talk about how the Mongols influenced trade in Eurasia? How did it not influence trade? That might be a better question. Man, the Mongols. Let's make a list of the most important things that we see. The first thing I would say is, one, the Mongols unite all of the Silk Roads under their authority. And if you recall back to our last time period, that the classical dynasties, when they're very powerful, whether in the Romans on one end, the Parthians, and the Han, those empires can provide protection over trade routes, right? So protection from bandits, or providing systems of weight and measures for trade, or whatever it is to facilitate trade. Well, with the Mongols conquering the entirety of the Silk Road, they're able to do this, but instead of having 3 or 4 try to work together on this, this is one ruling group. They issue things like passports to people to allow them to trade across the Mongol Empire. You have the law code of the Mongols is very favorable to trade, the Yassa, Y-A-S-S-A. And as you know, it's kind of like a positive feedback loop. Trade begets more trade. So as the Mongols start to see this, or facilitate this rise of trade, whether it's from Russia to the Byzantine Empire to the Middle East, to India, to China, that's going to spur more growth as technologies transfer. You know, paper and gunpowder are the big technologies that transfer in this time period, but block printing will also transfer under the Mongols. We'll see that move. We'll see ideas move, right? Mathematics and astronomy those ideas start to be shared between China and the Middle East to make rapid advancements. And then lastly, of course, disease, right? Disease spreads in this time period too, wherever these trade routes go. So those are some of the ways that they influence trade in this time period. Of course, Europeans were already beginning to trade more with the Middle East, but you can imagine that like the Italian city-states that are important for trade, Venice, Milan, Florence, right? They're going to continue they're going to have greater access to goods coming out of Asia, especially the Venetians, who have their small trading empire, because of this Mongol development, right? That is promoting trade. And so those goods will make their way to Europe, which will, of course, help spur on more European economic growth. There's many reasons why the Mongols don't conquer Europe. One, there's a really great story of the Pope and one of the Mongol Khans, I forget which one it is, sending letters back and forth, and the Pope sends a letter to the Khan and says, you know, you need to convert to Christianity, and then you won't mess with us. You'll see my supreme authority. And the Mongol Khan replies with something to the effect of, "Look at all we have conquered. We have conquered everything, the entire world. Maybe you should come here and bow down to me rather than the other way around." And you know, the Pope really didn't have much to say about it. However, the Great Khan at that time died, and the Mongol hordes kind of went back to elect the new Great Khan and never really get back to take over Western Europe. Not that they would want to. Western Europe is not full of pasture lands, which is what the Mongols preferred. Anyways, that was a sidetrack. How much did American cultures influence each other? Oh, good question. When we think about American cultures, right, in the Americas and how they influence each other, we have to understand that these, just like in Europe, you have these or in Afro-Eurasia, where you have these kind of civilization waves, right? We have these, first wave civilizations are cradles of civilization. You have these like empires that develop, maybe second wave, and you have these third wave civilizations that come about in our post-classical era. The Americas have similar stuff, right? You have the Aztecs building on the legacy of like the Teotihuacan and the Toltecs. The Mayans are building on the legacy of the Olmecs. The Inca are building on the legacy of the Chavin civilization that came before them, and the Moche civilization. So they are incorporating like cultural beliefs, cultural practices. Certainly they are probably taking governing styles or military practices from people who came before them. The flip side of maybe perhaps a question might be like, why then don't we know so much about the connections here? And that is because outside of the Mayans, we really don't have like written records of this stuff, right? So the Inca have a way of keeping records, the quipu, but that's a knot tying system. They're not leaving vast written records. A lot of what we know about the Inca is either through archaeology or the Spanish accounts of the Inca. So it's tough to say exactly how much these cultures influence each other, but through archaeological evidence, we do know that they kind of built off of previous cultures and made some advancements. All right. Oh, good question. This is something I wanted to talk about because we didn't have time in class. How much do you have to know about travelers and traders from this time period? So what's important to know about travelers and traders is that this is emblematic of cross-cultural exchange, right? We have these new or intensifying networks of communication and exchange, aka trade networks. And as these networks intensify, more and more people are going to travel from place to place. We've seen that already, right? We know that that occurs in the Indian Ocean because you have, for example, these cosmopolitan cities popping up in the Swahili city-states of East Africa, in places like Kilwa, or on the Malabar coast of India, or the city of Malacca, right? Or, or on the Arabian Peninsula. So we know we have these cosmopolitan cities, and you know that you have these cultural exchanges occurring, right? Muslim merchant diasporic communities in the Indian Ocean, Chinese merchant diasporic communities in Southeast Asia. We see Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean and even in the Indian Ocean basin, but the Mediterranean is particularly important for some of the stuff we're going to talk about next unit. So it makes sense that because of the interconnectedness, especially in Afro-Eurasia, that there would be travelers. And what's great is that they write about their travels. So we have and most of what I was going through and reading is from Key Concept 3.1, Roman numeral 3. So if you want to take a look back at the key concepts in Google Classroom, you can see that. But they write about their travels. And so this gives us a really interesting peek into these early cross-cultural exchanges, some of which we do not have quite as much in the classical era, even though we know people were trading, right? Instead, we have people like Ibn Battuta, who writes about his travels all around the world. He travels to places like West Africa, right? He goes to the kingdom of Mali and he writes about his experience there. And he writes about the rituals in the kingdom of Mali court. And he laments the fact that he is not being given the same lavish gifts that he received when he went to India, right? And he receives from all these princes when he arrives. These Muslim princes on the coast of India, they lavish him with gifts because he is this Muslim scholar, and he brings with him lots of books and gifts for them. But when he arrives at Mali, he's kind of like turned off by some of their customs. what that shows us is that there's a wide variety of the way people interact with visitors. There is a wide variety in the way Islam is practiced, right? In West Africa, Ibn Battuta is impressed by some of the piousness of the Muslims there, but at the same time, he's turned off by some of the practices which would not be considered proper in the Middle East. For example, women not covering their heads, or women conversing with men who aren't their husbands. So it offers us a pretty interesting view. In some cases, these views can tell us a lot. And in some cases, they just tell us a lot about the person writing them, right? Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta, we know that they have a limited worldview, and they kind of struggle with understanding some of these different cultures. So I think that is particularly important. But also they kind of leave these great travel journals. Some of them, are very accurate. Some of them may not be quite as accurate. In fact, Marco Polo's travel journals were nicknamed the Million Lies because people just did not believe that what he was saying was accurate. Though, as we look in history, it may be more than they thought, although it is very likely that he exaggerated some aspects of the tale, or at least the person he told it to, who wrote it down, exaggerated many aspects of his tales. So they give us just rich information about these trade networks and cultures that were different from their own. That's kind of what you need to know. You likely will see excerpts or writings from these travelers on tests. Ibn Battuta is a very popular example of this, and kind of just set him in that context. Now, he was traveling in the 1300s. Marco Polo was traveling in 50 or 60 years earlier in the 1200s, somewhere around the 1270s. I guess not 50 years, maybe 30 years earlier. And Yuan Zhang, who was the Buddhist monk who traveled, let me see if I can dig up a date on him. Looking through Freemanpedia to see if he has some dates with these Muslim travels. He does not. So you'll just have to look that up. Or I can do that right now. He is around the year 600. So he's very early on in the early Tang dynasty, I guess Sui/Tang dynasties of China. He's the one that we talked about. We're going to India and collecting Buddhist texts and bringing them back with him. All right, let's go on to the next question. Can you explain the interactions between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church? Sure thing. I'd be happy to. The Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church, of course, are branches of the early Christian church. Christianity really kind of develops as like a cult out of Judaism, and then blossoms into its own religion, especially with the writings of the Gospels and these early missionaries, like, for example, Peter and Paul, right? Now, Christianity spreads to several regions, right? It spreads to Rome and begins to spread throughout Italy. It gets to Constantinople. It's, of course, strong in the Middle East and North Africa, wherever the Roman Empire was. But there are specific areas that are cities which are kind of home to the church, like are major bishops of the church, or patriarchs, we call them. One is in Rome, one is in Constantinople, and Antioch, and Jerusalem, and Alexandria, right? Those are the 5 major patriarchs. And they all were considered, or many of them considered, to be relatively equal, right? They both oversaw the growth of the Christian church. There were some minor differences in beliefs, but there was still kind of a central creed, what we call the Nicene Creed, because it was from the Council of Nicaea under the Emperor Constantine when he converted to Christianity. And basically, all Christians had agreed that they would that they believed in these certain things. And the Christians who did not, they were kicked their way down the Silk Road, and we've talked generally about them in the last unit. Now, the big dispute comes in around the middle of the 11th century, right? In the year 1054 is the specific split that occurs in the Christian church. And it splits basically east and west. The Pope in Rome, being the successor to Saint Peter, right? This apostle of Jesus, claimed, based on religious beliefs and quotes attributed to in the Gospels, that Peter was the rock on which the Christian church should be built, and that as the successor of Saint Peter, the Pope in Rome was the most important patriarch of the church. Well, obviously, you can imagine the other patriarchs of the church are not so keen on this idea, right? They don't necessarily agree that any one of them is more powerful. And there are all other kind of minor disputes in the church. A lot of them like deep theological debates that we're not going to get too much into. Some of these debates are in reference to, for example, like what type of bread should be used during the during the Eucharist, the celebration of the Eucharist at Mass. So you can imagine that there's a lot going on there. Why is that important? Well, these disputes become so great that the church formally splits, right? You have this one Christian church with these different patriarchs. And here we have a schism, right? A split between the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, which recognizes the authority of the Pope in Rome, the Patriarch of Rome, as the head of the church on earth, right? What he does will be bound in heaven or whatever. The other patriarchs, of course, disagree with that, and so we have that big split. There's another thing. There are other things that divide them. For example, the Roman Church used Latin, and the Orthodox churches tended to use Greek as their language. So there were some cultural differences there as well. And over time, that split and the divisions with that split kind of grow more and more. There have been some attempts, kind of more in the more modern era, to mend some of those splits, and some of them have. But that split definitely occurs in 1054. It was widened by Western Christian actions in the Crusades, especially with the Fourth Crusade, which attacks Constantinople. So, that's not a good idea for putting back together Europe. I was going to see if I missed anything else. I keep flipping around this book, but I keep thinking more things to say. So before I move on, I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything else that I think would be important to mention. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That might be too much information actually on that topic, but it's something I generally know about. Though I have to acknowledge my bias as a Roman Catholic. Though I definitely see how they screwed that one up. What major differences between the Chinese dynasties and empires should we be aware of? Are there any important patterns? Good question. Let's talk about patterns, let's say, that exist from between these Chinese dynasties, or what we should know about them. First of all, let's forget about the Yuan Dynasty right now, and let's just think about the Sui, Tang, Song, and maybe the Ming. All of these dynasties will build upon kind of those earlier frames, that kind of legacy of the Han, right? They will have Confucian civil service exams. They will, except for a brief period, of course, in the Tong, give preference to Chinese religions, right? Again, forgetting about the Yuan, they will, and belief systems. So religious belief system like Taoism, Confucianism, ancestor veneration, the like. They establish a bureaucracy, right? A centralized government. They put emphasis on Confucian civil service exams. They tend to expand every time. The Tong Dynasty establishing tribute states, which is a kind of an interesting innovation in Chinese government. If we think kind of beyond just like the building upon what had happened earlier, establishing those tributary states is important. The Song Dynasty really can't do that quite as well because they are very innovative, but after a brief period of power, they succumb to northern nomads. But the Ming Dynasty tries to do the same thing, right? They send out Zheng He and his fleets to establish tributary states in the Indian Ocean. But because the government does not see these as lucrative, they're not making enough money from this. They're not getting enough. They withdraw from the Indian Ocean and decide to just kind of forgo that and forgo influence in that region. It also might have been some politics at play. Zheng He was a Muslim eunuch, and other Muslim eunuchs were gaining kind of high positions within the Chinese government, and so more traditionalists, it seemed, did not want that to occur. So those are kind of the big things. In terms of what are the things to remember about each dynasty, we'll go through these. First of all, the Sui Dynasty. Important for reunifying China after the fall of the Han, right? You have about 300 years of disunity in China before the Sui put everything back together again, and they build the Grand Canal. That's going to be significant because it allows the government in northern China to exert control over southern China much more easily, and also encourages trade from north to south, which of course leads to economic success. The Tong Dynasty is really our high point, our golden age of Chinese civilization. The Chinese empire expands down the Silk Road, controlling more land than it ever had before, exerts power to the south, has cultural influence over Japan, Korea, and somewhat, to varying, some limited success in Vietnam. We talked about that with our lesson on signification. The Tong Dynasty also noteworthy if we think about the spread of Buddhism, which our DBQ was on, and how people reacted to that. Buddhism had done very well after the fall of the Han and is actually elevated by Empress Wu over Taoism in China in terms of importance. And some of the civil service exams are modified to include more aspects of Buddhism. But because of the growing wealth of the monasteries and Buddhism and this outside religion becomes a good scapegoat for economic troubles in China, in which case they try to purge it, right? They destroy temples and the like, elevate Confucianism and Taoism back up. We get this idea of NeoConfucianism, which also spreads beyond the Tong Dynasty borders. It's also a period of growth of trade on the Silk Road. The Tong Dynasty come into contact with the Abbasids, and trade along the Silk Road really reemerges pretty strongly. What else about the Tong do I need to say? I think that's the big ones. There's one other thing that I had thought of that I've let slip my mind. What can you do? And now let's talk about the Song Dynasty, right? It follows the Tong. Song Dynasty is known mostly for innovations, paper money, more innovation in gunpowder, though it had been invented earlier. There's kind of two time periods within the Song Dynasty: the Northern Song Dynasty, where you have the capital in Beijing, and then the Southern Song, when these northern nomadic groups successfully push China to the south, invade and take over the northern parts of China. The Southern Song moves the capital to Hangzhou and continues on for quite some time after, until eventually the Mongols come in, conquering all of northern China and then all of southern China, or the Song Dynasty. Oh, Tong Dynasty. Remember what I was going to say. Remember that champa rice is introduced to China during that time period, which leads to population explosions. Now, if we think about what's the outlier here? In China, it is the Yuan Dynasty, right? So this is one of kind of the four big khanates that are left over from the breaking apart of Genghis Khan's empire. It's started by Kublai Khan and continues further on. Several changes are made under the Yuan Dynasty, one of which is the suspension of civil service exams, an upending of the Chinese social hierarchy, right? The merchants and traders who are at the kind of the bottom of the Chinese social hierarchy, because, as one writer put it, they earn their money off the backs of other people's work, taking but not adding to China. That's a pretty harsh way to put it, but a pretty interesting thing to kind of look at the Chinese beliefs there. But merchants and traders are really important in the Mongol empire, or to Mongols and these pastoral nomads who were also traders. And so you have instead these traders elevated above what they would have been in other Chinese dynasties. And when the Ming Dynasty comes back to power, well, what do you think happens? It switches back. They kind of make a formal change back, putting merchants and traders back where they saw fit. Also, under the Yuan Dynasty, one of the reasons why a lot of those Chinese beliefs are able to persist is because they kind of purposefully make sure to separate Mongols from the Han Chinese, right? They do not allow intermarriage, and they kind of prevent them from rising to higher levels in government. So those are some things with the Chinese dynasties that you should be aware of. In terms of patterns, just think about some of the continuities that exist in Chinese society. The importance of Confucianism and the Confucian hierarchy, filial piety, etc., the Confucian civil service exams, bureaucratic system. Those are what you need to know. All right, next question. Will we have to be able to distinguish between different crusades and what they did and did not accomplish? All right, interesting question. This gets into the idea of, how in the weeds do we need to get? What are the facts that you need to know? Let's just say this. There are 4 crusades that are important out of the dozen or so that there are. None of them are the Children's Crusade. That's just a fun story. And none of the ones that follow ducks, etc., are things that you need to know. But again, fun stories that show kind of the religious hysteria of the time. I would say you need to know the First Crusade. It's called in 1095. It's relatively successful. By 1098 or 1099, Christians have conquered most of the Holy Land. They have kingdoms set in like Antioch and Jerusalem and Tyre, I think, is one of them. And they conquer these major cities. And it's fairly successful. They hold on to them for somewhere around 90 years before, which is not like a short period of time to have these outsiders coming in, these outside invaders running kingdoms in the Middle East. However, of course, Saladin eventually regains control of Jerusalem. Second and Third Crusades, I don't have much for you to know there. Just know that some of them go through Europe, and like the First Crusade, basically wreak havoc on Jewish populations across Central and Eastern Europe on their way to the Holy Land. Let's not forget that. We did a whole big 2 or 3 days thinking about how these different cultures view these crusades, right? And we know that it's not just Christians versus Muslims, right? Muslims saw it as invaders, and Jews saw it as devastating for their populations of Europe, as anti-Semitism was extremely ran rampant. But this, of course, they served as basically these target practice for these kind of bloodthirsty Christians. And then other Christians trying to recontextualize what happened in the Crusades no, those are not real Christians, right? Kind of ideas. So just in general, know that trend. The other crusade, other than the First Crusade, that I would say definitely know is the Fourth Crusade, which doesn't even make it to the Middle East, instead attacks Constantinople. Again, the incredibly shrinking empire of the Byzantines, but really you have like a permanent weakening of the city. Christians, the Christian armies that attack it in order to pay off their passage with the Venetians, they ransack this. They ransack the city. They steal. You know, Constantinople was easily the richest city in the world. Probably, had had just many Christian artifacts and relics and the like, and of course filled with gold and jewels and all these things that were in these amazing churches and cathedrals that were built throughout the city and in the empire. And of course, those are just ransacked, and much of that wealth is taken. From what people I've talked to that have visited, of course, a lot of that remains just because there was so much. But nevertheless, it was kind of a big deal. So 1 in 4. There you go. Is there a reason as to why the Black Death's effect on China and neighboring regions was not as well documented as Europe? Well, I have to say I can't answer your question as asked, because I don't know how well documented it is in China. Certainly, one of the reasons why we know it is well documented in Europe is because of the prevalence of Western Civ courses, right? Also, the documentation of the Black Death in Europe is in languages that are more often translated into English, perhaps, than what we see in China. So I don't know if what the repercussions were in China and how much were written there about it there. One of the reasons why it is so important to the narrative of European history is that the drop in population of about 1/3 of Europeans dying from this disease had massive ramifications for Europe. Not just kind of a re-understanding of like the decline of cities that we see for a time, but it was extremely significant in the ending of the feudal system. Imagine this: you have lots of people working, bound to the land, basically in this coerced labor system known as feudalism, where you can't leave the land, and 1/3 of people die. Well, that doesn't mean that you have less work that needs to be done, right? There are some cities that need to be supplied with food. There are still, general maintenance that needs to go on of Europe at large, right? All of these feudal kingdoms. But because of the high demand for labor, these laborers could now start demanding things of their own, especially wages, right? And so the Black Death's effects on Europe really, I would say, one of the more significant things that I tend to think of, other than just the decline in population and the like, is its effect on the structure of Europe in general. The feudal structure starts to break down, and eventually that will give rise later on to more powerful states and more free wage labor. People not being bound to land. Eventually, after the Black Death is over, people can start moving towards cities again as Europe continues its economic recovery after its setback of the Black Plague. So I would say that is the big effect to think about. Now, is it not as well documented in China? I don't know. I would say in my own knowledge of history, I'm a little weak there. So I wish I could answer that question better. But it is a really interesting question to think about, and ponder. We have to know about Kievan Rus and its impact on the rest of Europe. Yes. Short answer. Will we need to know anything about the Mali Empire? Yes. That's the short answer. So let's talk a little bit about Kievan Rus. First of all, Kievan Rus is modern day Ukraine, Kiev, right? So this is like the center of what we might consider to be like the start of Russian civilization. It is believed, from my understanding, that Vikings settled down in the region after kind of plundering and pillaging Europe and going up all these rivers and stuff. They settled down in this region and establish what will become known as like Russian culture, right? You have these Slavic peoples that settle down in this area. Now, we have them making contact with these like Viking peoples who expanded into the region, and they begin trading, right? So this region that we consider to be like Kiev and Rus, which kind of starts to develop around 750, 800 or whatever, with all these Slavic peoples, they are connected via rivers like the Dnieper River, there's one other one, to the Black Sea, basically. Well, what this means is, in order to engage in more and more trade, they have to make a choice, right? So they could be more connected to what's going on in Western Europe, or they could be more connected to what's going on in the Byzantine Empire, right, to their south. Well, the Byzantine Empire is a gateway to many other trade in the Mediterranean, trade in what will become the Islamic, or what is the Islamic world by this point. And so they start to make those trade connections. Another thing to keep in mind about Kiev and Rus is that as these people convert to Christianity, they're converting to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, not the Western Roman Catholic Christianity the rest of Europe is doing, but to the brand of Christianity that is connected with the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. That is one of the things that kind of separates this region, this area of Russia, this kind of very unique cultural element that some people say, oh, it's not quite Asian, it's not quite European, right? Because culturally they are separate or separated from what is going on in Europe. Another thing, when the Mongols come along, of course, that's going to further that separation, especially as the capital moves to Moscow and the like. But it's kind of like the cradle of what we might consider to be Russian civilization, I would say. When we think about Kiev and Rus, it's really like feudal kind of setup. It's a collection of these like cities with surrounding areas. You might consider them like city-states. So the most powerful of these cities was Kiev, which is what kind of we use this term Kiev and Rus. But keep in mind, we're talking about kind of a larger area. Take a look through the reading that you actually had on this to make sure I did not miss anything. I mean, I probably missed something, but that's important. The next thing was about the Mali Empire. Mali Empire in West Africa, important trading empire. Of course, Ibn Battuta even visits it. Also, starting with shortly before the Mali Empire in Ghana, the Islam had begun to spread across the Sahara Desert into West Africa. The elites of these empires, and the Mali Empire was not an exception to this, converted to Islam. Mansa Musa is kind of an interesting turning point in history, if we think about that, kind of an inflection point where he makes his Hajj to Mecca. People see kind of how rich he is, and thus it spurs on more trade between North Africa, the Middle East, and West Africa and the sub-Saharan region. So kind of think about its importance in trade, that connection of sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and eventually the Mediterranean, right, and Europe. Gold that's coming out of West Africa makes its way to Europe. This is something eventually, when we get into the 1400s, that Europeans know, and the Portuguese start their exploration of the African coast in order to bypass trade with Muslims and access that gold directly. Of course, slaves and ivory are also important things that are being traded out of West Africa to Northern Africa in exchange primarily for salt. Can you join it? Yeah, everybody's welcome in this whatever this is, Google Hangout, whatever we're doing. Do we need to know about the Polynesian migrations? It was in the one pager, but I don't know if we went over it in class. I was able to talk about the Polynesian migrations, I believe, with 6th period, maybe not so much with 7th today because we were a little behind. It is certainly covered in your textbook. I believe it's covered in the last chapter of this unit. In terms of what you need to know about the Polynesian migrations, they continue in this time period, just like the Bantu migrations that we talked about in the last unit continue in this time period. The Bantu migration spreading agriculture, some crops like bananas, which spread to Africa and then spread to the interior of Africa. They spread iron making technology and the like throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The Polynesian, and also the Bantu language family. The Polynesian migrations have similar, my gosh, people are texting. These are all my college buddies, I guess, wanting us to watch the Notre Dame basketball game. The Polynesian migrations have similar effects. They spread the Polynesian family of languages throughout Pacific Islands. They also spread the certain crops and like animals throughout. We think about the ones that come to mind are like pigs and chickens, right? Spread from island to island in the Polynesian migrations. But these language families as well. The key concepts bring these up and say it's found in, I'm trying to look here. I've flipped over my key concepts, but this is not working for me. Let's see. Well, I can't find it. Oh, some migrations had a significant environmental impact. So this is talking about with trade, people moving from place to place caused environmental and linguistic effects. The Polynesian migrations led to people cultivating transplanted foods and domesticated animals as they moved to new islands. It also diffused languages, the Polynesian languages, from place to place as people moved from one area to another. So that's generally what it's in reference to. In terms of crops that spread, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I believe bananas spread, I want to say. But I am blanking. See if I can find some examples. Got to find where it is in our book here, or in a different book actually that I'm looking at. I can't find it. I have to tell you another time. So I know the animals, they're correct. So stick with that. That's probably what you need to know about it. What do we need to know about trade routes and trade in this time period? Oh, that is a big question. And we've spent a couple days on that in class. So I'm going to refer you to the one-pager, Key Concept 3.1 in Freemanpedia. That lists everything you need to know about trade routes. We have 4 big ones: the Silk Road, Trans-Saharan, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean. Remember, the Indian Ocean is the number one. That's the big guy in this time period. New trade routes led to powerful new trading cities, places like Novgorod, Timbuktu, Hangzhou, Calicut in India, Venice in the Mediterranean, Malacca in the Indian Ocean, Kilwa in the Indian Ocean on the east coast of Africa, all these things. These trade routes also led to new luxury goods and some old luxury goods continuing to spread. There's commercial technology that aided that spread, new navigational technology. There are economic tools and ways governments support trade along these routes. It's all in that really great in review Key Concept 3.1 one-pager. If that is not enough for you, I'd say take a look at Freemanpedia. You got to know about the Trans-Saharan Network. You've got to know about the Mediterranean. You've got to know about the Silk Road. You've got to know about the Indian Ocean. That's what I would say. Oh, Rowan, yeah, great. I'm famous. Third video in a very specific search. If you threw RTHS_Patrick Lassiter in there, I bet I'd have been first. Next question, though, is that you mentioned the Swahili language appearing as a result of the Bantu migrations. How much do we need to know about Swahili on the Swahili coast? Good question. So the Bantu language family, linguists believe, are connected to these Bantu migrations. The Swahili language itself, I'm going to pull information here so I'm a little bit more concise, because I'm not usually. The Swahili language is a really good example of syncretism, actually. It is a blending of traditional African religions with languages that the east coast of Africa would have come into contact with in the Indian Ocean. This includes Arabic, right? With the arrival of Islam, we have Arabic words coming into use in the east coast of Africa, combining with traditional African languages. And so we have this kind of language of Swahili develop. However, there are a lot of other words in the Swahili language that borrow from other locations on the Indian Ocean. There are words that come from South Asia and even as far away as China that are used throughout the Indian Ocean, but have maybe their origins in India and China, and they make their way into usage in the Swahili language. And that doesn't stop at the end of this time period. There are also words, when the Portuguese come in to the Indian Ocean, words from Portuguese naturally will be incorporated into these local languages, especially in more diverse regions, further causing some changes in the Swahili language. It happens in every language, everywhere. You can think about words that we have in English that borrow from French or German or Arabic, or, well, any number of languages around the world. Same thing happens with the development of Swahili. But it is specifically, it's noteworthy that it really starts to develop with the interactions with Arab Islamic merchant traders. Yeah. And of course, where this language is used is also where we get the name for that East Coast, the Swahili coast, or the Swahili city-states. Yeah, and it's still spoken in Africa today. Interesting pun there. Khan, you talk about the nomadic group that conquered much of Eurasia. Yes, the Mongols, of course, are the big ones in this time period. Again, we've spent a lot of time on them, so I'm just going to refer you to the Freemanpedia one-pager on the Mongols. Here's the rundown. This is, if you can't find it and you need to know what it says, we're thinking about the Mongols. They're from about the year 1200 to about the year 1350, somewhere in there, 1375 maybe. They are a pastoral group of people who were on the steppe lands of what is now Mongolia. And they were originally kind of many different tribes, but under Genghis Khan, they are united together. He uses a number of tools to do this. One is even in that kind of most basic formation of the military, in the Arban, the Arban, that group of 10 men who are, the basic fighting unit. He makes sure to not just group people by bloodline or by clan or tribe or whatever you want to call it, but he mixes these people together and creates a Mongol identity out of them. He encourages people who may be part of the Mongol tribe to intermarry with other conquered groups to, again, create this Mongol identity. And from there, they plunder and pillage and dominate their way across the Asian landmass, setting up this great empire. Its state form, the Khanate, really breaks down into four, right? We have the Golden Horde, the Khanate of the Great Khan, which is in China and East Asia, the Chagadai Khanate, which we didn't talk much about, and the Ilkhanate in the the Middle East and Persia. The Khanate has a Khan or king on top of it. They are advised by kind of a council of people. Women even have some sort of say in government. Certain women do, elite women. And yeah, it's basically administered by the descendants of Genghis Khan, who has kind of this really important status. There is, once they conquer everything, Silk Road, we refer to that as the Pax Mongolica, where we see trade and all that stuff that we've already talked about tonight become very important. Yeah, I think the only other thing maybe we haven't talked about with the Mongols is religion. Remember that they practice shamanism, but they also practice other religions that they came into contact with on the Silk Road, including but not limited to Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. Various forms of Christianity, which sometimes they practice more than one of those religions, and sometimes they practiced it alongside of shamanism. But the Mongol Empire itself was tolerant of all different religions. So all of them existed within the Mongol borders. All right. So I'll answer questions about a couple more questions here. Do you need to know anything about the Italian city-states? Well, yes, you need to know a little bit about all of these things. The Italian city-states, remember, are kind of a new form. Well, it's hard to say that any city-state is a new form of government, but it is a revived form of government, perhaps, found in the Italian peninsula, beginning in the High Middle Ages. And what we see are these cities start to reconnect, perhaps, with their old classical history. Cities like Venice, Milan, what do we say? Florence, I think, was another one. They come about as major trade centers, and they begin to dominate Mediterranean trade. Venice would be the most significant of those in terms of dominating trade. And they're really important, especially beginning with the Crusades, as being important trade conduits between Europe and Asia. Later on, they will continue to trade, as Freemanpedia mentions. So this isn't all in my head. This is something that I always have to go back to notes on. They later trade with the Ottoman Empire, and they have no problem with that, right? These are not people who are kind of worried about, oh, we're trading with like a Muslim empire at all. They're all about making money and being that connection. The Portuguese and Spanish, however, kind of getting into next unit things, they are not going to be too happy with trading with Muslims. First of all, they fight for hundreds of years against Muslim armies in the Iberian Peninsula. And so about the time they kick them out and win these wars, and reconquer, we call these the Reconquista, actually. They reconquer the Iberian Peninsula. They're going to look for a way around trading with the Muslim world. And eventually they succeed. All right. We have gone down a very pun-laden path here in the question. So it's about 9:30. So we did this for about an hour and 20 minutes. I know I started I think around 8:10. I know I was late, but hopefully I've gotten your questions answered. Remember that it's more about trends. It's thinking about how you can set documents within kind of a context that you have built in your mind. That's context, not a pun. And then how you can use that to answer questions. Usually all this information that you have swimming around your head, it does coalesce when you think about the questions and the answer choices. You can eliminate answer choices. You can hopefully narrow down your choices, or at least better understand these documents by being able to fit them within that heavy AP level content. So we'll see what you can do tomorrow on the test, and I hope you have a good evening. I think that's everything that we have answered. So I will say goodbye and see you tomorrow.